Hi, and welcome to Your Gov Non-Part, Political Science and Government for Everyone. And welcome to Part 2 on our series on jurisdiction. This particular section will be on exceptions, because for every rule there's an exception, and jurisdiction certainly falls in that category. Some notable exceptions to the idea of jurisdiction that we covered in Part 1 are diplomatic missions. Now, a diplomatic mission can be one of two things. Either a group of people, such as an envoy, that are traveling from a foreign nation to a host nation. They are extraterritorial. They are sovereign. And they have a certain amount of diplomatic immunity. Another example that would be, the second one, which would be a physical place, would be something such as the United Nations building in New York City. In this case, the United States has ceded, given up, is what that means, a certain amount of their jurisdiction to the United Nations to place inside the confines of the building itself. Now, diplomatic mission is a rather broad term, and we tend to think of it in the next item, which is a little more finite term, which are embassies and consulates. Now, the misconception is that an embassy, one, is a place, and two, is sovereign soil. Both are incorrect. The embassy, or the consulate, are the group of people, the ambassador, the deputy ambassador, and their entourage at the embassy in the capital city, or the consular general and his entourage at a consulate in a non-capital city, are the embassy or the consulate. In the case of the embassy, they are in a building inside of a compound, which is called a chancery. Now, it's often believed, again, regardless of the terminology, that that piece of physical ground is foreign soil, that it is extraterritorial, and that's not true. That chunk of land still belongs to the United States. However, the United States, in our example, and this happens in most nations that have foreign embassies and foreign chanceries, we have ceded jurisdiction to that area to the visiting nation. So, while technically still physically part of the United States and not foreign soil, it is where no one's allowed to enter the grounds of the Chancery without the permission of the diplomats in the embassy. So, this becomes, yes, kind of a sensitive jurisdictional issue, because yes, it's still United States soil, but we have ceded our jurisdiction over that soil to a visiting nation. Now, another common misconception deals with Indian reservations. It's often believed that Indian reservations are in fact sovereign nations, and this could not be further from the truth. Indian reservations, however, are a slightly different type of government than what you may be accustomed to, called a tripartite government, consisting of the United States federal government, the state and or local government, and the tribal government. Each of these have, obviously, their own jurisdictions. The tribal government usually has jurisdiction over things like land usage or minor infractions of law, whereas major infractions of the law, egregious infractions, felonies, those sorts of things still fall under the jurisdiction of the state, or more likely the federal government, either through the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, or the Department of Indian Affairs. So it is not a sovereign nation in the absolute confines of the idea of a sovereign nation. They have a certain amount of sovereignty, and that's why you often find, yes, they have the jurisdiction over land usage rights, and you will find casinos, for example, can be built there without a gaming permit issued by the state because they have the jurisdiction over that, whereas outside of the reservation, in states that allow gaming, the state has to issue a gaming license. Okay. The next area of exception is a very broad area of law, which is maritime law, the law of the seas. Exceptions on jurisdiction would be United States owned and registered vessels on the high seas. Even though they are outside of the 200-mile jurisdictional limit of the United States, because they are owned by United States citizens, they are still subject to the laws of the United States, even on the open high seas, and are subject to law enforcement, say through the United States Coast Guard, or on the high seas, more likely through the law enforcement operations of the United States Navy. Inside of foreign territorial waters, they are still subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, but then they also become, to some degree, subject to the jurisdiction of the host nation. Now, the same holds true for ships in United States territorial waters. They are sovereign soil, and while ships are boarded and inspected, you can't forcibly board a foreign ship without very good reason. It used to be called probable cause, and now it's called reasonable suspicion, but you better have very good reasonable suspicion for a reason to forcibly board a foreign vessel in United States waters, because it is still technically, if it's flagged and registered under a foreign nation, it is sovereign soil of that nation. Lastly, we have, again, a very broad but unusual exception to the idea of jurisdiction in the military. Now, this deals with two parts, two different ideas in the military, and one is military bases, and one is military personnel. Generally speaking, a military base on foreign soil, and we have many of them, we have them in nations around the world, the jurisdiction for that particular base, by agreement with the host nation, much like an embassy, the jurisdiction has been ceded to the United States, and via the Department of Defense and their sub-departments, the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, Department of the Air Force, whatever, have jurisdiction over the happenings and the infractions within that base. However, additionally, usually with nations that are hosting our troops, or when we're hosting troops from other nations, and I've personally seen this happen, where we have Mexican airmen here in the United States that I've seen on many occasions. We have agreements with these nations that the personnel are still under the jurisdiction of their home country. So they are subject to the laws of their own country, and they're subject to the laws of the country they're in, of course. They can't go and do things that are against the law of the country they're in, but the jurisdiction for trying and adjudicating them falls to their parent country. So while local authorities might detain a military personnel, they won't arrest them, likely. They will detain them and they will deliver them to the authorities of the visiting nation. And this is very common with military personnel. There is one other unusual and notable exception to the idea of jurisdiction, and that's the idea between extraterritorial jurisdiction, that which is granted to someone outside of a territory, as we've discussed, or the idea of claimed extraterritorial jurisdiction, where the nation claims jurisdiction over something unilaterally. The classic example of this is the nation of France. Now, under the French Penal Code, and we've actually listed the link for the French Penal Code section that deals with this. Under the French Penal Code, citizens of the nation of France who are either the victims of or accused of a crime in a foreign nation still fall under the jurisdiction of the nation of France. Now, this becomes a little complicated because even though they claim jurisdiction, it's not quite like the gendarme can get on a plane, fly over here, come knock on your door and drag you away in chains. They don't really, they can't really have, they don't have the authority to do that. They don't have the jurisdiction. They claim the jurisdiction, but they don't have it. So even though their federal penal code reads that way, what they're probably going to end up doing is they're going to end up working through a joint agreement with another nation to have those federal authorities detain and arrest the individual and turn that individual over to, whether it's a French citizen who's here, say in the United States, or someone who's committed a crime against a French citizen. And it's going to depend on which one of those situations it is, whether the individual gets turned over or not. Will then be turned over to the gendarme and flown back to I don't know, Paris, I guess, and tried in a French court. This becomes a very sensitive issue. Again, depending on whether the French citizen is the accused or the victim is going to make a difference. But this is very likely going to escalate into a political negotiation beyond that of law enforcement agencies, where we're probably going to end up with the executive branches of both governments involved. Here in the United States, it's going to be through the Department of State. And in France, I would suspect it would be the foreign minister or minister of justice or something like that. And this is probably going to involve some negotiations at the political level as to who has jurisdiction over the particular situation, the infraction, the people involved. And this is a sensitive thing, much like maritime law, in the respect that, properly handled, it usually can go through diplomatic channels and it's settled. Improperly handled, it can escalate into bad feelings, into the necessity to bring in the International Criminal Court. It can potentially escalate into confrontation. Now that's rare, but it has happened. Historically, it has happened. But that's usually pretty rare. But it's an interesting exception to the complexities of jurisdiction and whether you actually have extraterritorial jurisdiction or whether you just unilaterally claim extraterritorial jurisdiction. So hopefully this gives you some idea of the many exceptions in the very complex system which is jurisdiction, and hopefully in future videos, as we begin to speak to experts and particular enforcement agencies and courts, you'll get a clearer and clearer idea of the complexities involved in jurisdiction. We'd like to thank you for watching part 2 of Your Gov Non-Parts series on jurisdiction. We hope that you'll take time to pick subscribe either here on the screen or above in the links. You can join us on Facebook at any time by picking the link below. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. We hope you'll take time to rate this video, either like or dislike. And as always, thank you for watching.